Hey y'all, thanks for joining me. I am Taylor, your host for today, and you are tuned into Georgia Smothered and Covered. Now, as you can clearly tell if you're watching and probably even if you're listening, I am not in a regular studio right now. I am standing in front of the Georgia State Capitol, which is where lawmakers will have until December 8th of this year to redraw state maps because the ACLU of Georgia and others successfully argued that the last set of maps discriminated against Black voters. By the end of the year, Georgia will have one additional majority Black congressional district, 2 new majority Black districts in the state Senate, and 5 new majority Black districts in the state House. The episode that you're about to hear was recorded before their case was heard and decided and puts a different perspective on things. With all that added context, keep listening to hear more about the case and what went on behind the scenes. With me, I have senior voting rights attorney at the ACLU of Georgia, Rahul Garabadu, and executive director of Common Cause Georgia, Aunna Dennis. Rahul has worked on voting rights issues from Georgia to Congo and will be litigating Georgia's upcoming federal redistricting cases. And somehow he still finds time to appear on Jeopardy and make TED Talks on top of all that. Aunna Dennis is an election protection organizing expert and the executive director of Common Cause Georgia. In addition to being a globetrotter herself, she has years of experience and expertise working to ensure equal access to the voting booth and coordinating community engagement platforms. Thank you both so much for joining us today. Let's get into the weeds of it all. All right, so I just want to level set and start off with a grounding question, just in case some folks don't know, but can you just share exactly what redistricting is and why we should care about it? I think start with you, Aunna.
Yeah, so redistricting in my mind, I'll just put it in like the unlegalese way of thinking about it, is thinking about how to redistribute people and redistribute resources and power. And redistricting here in Georgia, to put it in more context, has been something for many cycles or many years, many decades, that hasn't really included that people power. But what it has done is redistributed people, populations, communities, and this happens in Georgia, but it happens all over the country, and it also happens on our federal all the way down to our local levels.
So both of your organizations have federal redistricting cases that are going to court soon. How did we get here to the point where we even need federal cases?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. Back in 2021, when the census data came out showing the growth and changes in population demographics, it showed that Georgia had had an explosion in diversity over the last 10 years. And so the Georgia legislature, instead of celebrating that diversity, chose to draw maps that did not reflect the demographics of the state properly. So because of that, back in 2021, at the end of the year, when the governor signed those maps into law, our groups, and we represent the AME Church, Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity, as well as individual voters, we issued, we went out and filed a complaint in federal court, asserting that Black voters specifically, their power had been weakened in the maps that Georgia had just passed, and that Georgia could have and should have legally drawn more districts, state legislative districts, that took into account the growing power of Black voters.
And that's the state house and state senate districts, like
That's
both.
right.
Yeah,
That's
like how many exactly?
Well, our complaint asserts that there's at least half a dozen more
Wow.
districts that Georgia could have drawn that were districts where Black voters had an opportunity to elect candidates of choice.
So with this case, like how could it affect Georgia voters in the long run?
Well, I mean, redistricting, kind of like what Anna was saying, it goes to the bones of our democracy, right? These maps, they're not just in place for one election cycle, they're in place for a decade. And so, every type of decision, we're litigating on the state legislative maps. The Georgia state legislature decides issues on education, criminal justice reform, voting rights, reproductive rights, a number of issues that affect everyday Georgians' lives. And so having these maps, having them fairly reflect the demographics of this state is really, really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So with the Supreme Court's recent win that I mentioned earlier, we saw in Allen versus Milligan, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of more black districts and the Voting Rights Act and upheld Section 2 of the VRA. If that hadn't have happened, do you think we would be seeing these cases continue today?
I think that we would see them continue, but I do think that there may be a different take on what would be the outcome because we haven't got to court yet. We'll be there in like a week. But I do think the outcome would be different. And I do think the outcome would be different for not just Georgia, but for other states that have maps that are going to court. Something that happens here in Georgia is that we have mid-cycle redistricting here. Some states, they don't have to deal with that, where the legislature can come back and say, hey, we still don't like the way lines are drawn. They feel kind of funny about the increase of population or the explosion of new populations coming to the ballot booth. So I think that for us, particularly here, that our outcome would be different. I think our outcome would be similar to what we saw in 2010, where we had a lot of packing of populations together, or in our rural areas, we saw a lot of cracking of populations and splitting people into multiple districts where it looks really confusing of who actually represents you, who do you go to for resources. And like Rahul was saying, it's that it gets down to the bones of democracy, that the outcome would be that potentially things like CRT would be something that people wouldn't even feel empowered to talk about. Roe v. Wade with reproductive health and justice for our bodies, people wouldn't feel empowered. So I think that it all has this trickle effect to democracy.
To that point, how do you see this affecting other states, these cases going on here?
Sure. So, I mean, every case that happens, especially at the federal level, it has an impact. It creates precedent. And so it's really important to create good precedent in each of these cases. Now, all that precedent might not be binding on other states, but it begins a sort of track record. And so that's why it was so important, even at the Supreme Court level, to get that win in Milligan. The case that I'm litigating, we are litigating a similar type of case as the one in Alabama. And so having the Supreme Court reaffirm the protections of the Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was really, really important for our case. And so this win in Alabama, affects our ability to litigate here in Georgia as well.
So Rahul, what can you share about the case that you're litigating? Like, how strong of a case do you think you have? What's it like even litigating this kind of case?
Sure. So like I said, we brought this case at the end of 2021, and we moved on an emergency basis at that time because we wanted to ensure that these maps were struck down before the 2022 election cycle. So we had an emergency hearing back in February of 2022 where we essentially put forth evidence and put forward our case, showing why Georgia should have drawn more districts that allowed black voters to elect candidates of their choice. Now, the judge issued an opinion shortly after that hearing. It was about a 230-page opinion. 200 of those pages were basically saying that we were likely to succeed on the merits of this case, that we had a good case. The last 30 pages, unfortunately, talked about how we were too close to the election at hand, the primary elections in 2022. And unfortunately, we could not get relief before the 2022 election. So now about a year and a half has gone by. We now have this Supreme Court decision that reaffirms the protections of Section 2. And so we're now going to trial to decide these merits. And again, we have those, that prior decision that says that we are likely to succeed. So we're feeling really good about this case. We've marshaled evidence over the past couple of years to show exactly how these maps violate the Voting Rights Act. So now we're going into a 2-week trial, and we're feeling optimistic.
Okay. Wow, 2 weeks. Okay. I don't know if I was expecting longer. Maybe I watch like too much like true crime and see those cases take weeks and months. But okay. So what is it? What has been your experience as a litigation? I just know from what I see on TV, like how different is it from what you see on TV litigating this type of trial?
Yeah, well, now that we're so close to trial, it's very busy. There's a lot of prepping, a lot of writing motions, getting ready to marshal evidence, presenting witnesses. So it's hectic right now. But I think something that I really enjoy about litigating, especially voting rights cases, which is all that I do, is being able to talk to voters, talk to organizations who are doing the work on the ground to protect the right to vote. And so, being a voting rights litigator can be depressing at times in this day and age because of what's going on in legislatures around the country with court decisions. But I think the thing that kind of fills my cup is being able to talk to clients who are on the ground, protecting the right to vote no matter what happens. And I think it helps put things in context for me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely not sexy, but the support in the community helps. So Shelby v. Holder, in 2013, I think this year marks the 10-year anniversary of when that decision came. We saw Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act pretty much gutted. And that, I'm not even going to butcher what happened. I know y'all can explain it way better than I can. But essentially my question is, if you could explain what that is, and does that decision affect the case that y'all are presenting this year?
Yeah. So Shelby v. Holder, we kind of say it's the switch up of changing the formula of population and numbers, and it also struck down the pre-clearance, meaning it struck down the oversight of the DOJ being able to say, hey, if you were a state like Georgia, Texas, I think Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, that had a historic systemic racism history there, trajectory, that you don't have to show us your changes to like voting things. When I say voting things, that means like changes to how you want your lines drawn with redistricting, how you want your precincts to be mapped, how many precincts you'll have in a population, how many, even down to how many voting booths you'll have in a precinct. Different things like that used to have to be pre-cleared in certain states. And these are states that, have the relics of the Jim Crow South, or they're states that had populations that were that are not English speaking, or they could be tribal nations. So those areas were covered. Once Shelby v. Holder happened and the struck down happened, they're like, okay, it's open season. Open season to the point that in Texas, like 11 minutes afterwards, they created a voter ID provision 11 minutes after
Wow.
Shelby v. Holder was, decided on. And since then, we've seen these types of states try to manipulate populations and power and really dismantle what we had previously in voting rights. And, what we say about voting rights, it's not something that was given to populations that, I reflect or that, we're all responsive to. It wasn't given to us. So it had to be taken and it had to be fought for. And so with Shelby v. Holder, there was definitely a gutting of that. And we've seen the systemic process of the continue of gutting and eroding voting rights since that decision 10 years ago.
Yeah. So does the gutting of Section 5 and the decision of Shelby v. Holder, is that affecting, or is that just setting precedent for what we're seeing today and the cases that y'all are making? I guess because it's Section 5, does that have any reflection on Section 2?
So I do think that it definitely does have impact on the cases that we're a part of or that we represent, because it struck down things that were already going to be investigated or there was more oversight on, and now we have to do more type of, how do I say, we have to show more of the discriminatory impacts of what's happening to different populations without the DOJ being able to look at a database where, there were citations or there were claims already there so they could like view it. Now we have to really go deep into our communities, make sure that everyone's educated on what is your voting rights, how are you impacted as an individual, how are you impacted as a community, and how are you impacted as advocates as well. So how do we advocate and empower ourselves to learn as much as possible to get really deep in the weeds, because it's Georgia. These weeds with voting rights definitely grow and they're pervasive down here.
Yeah.
So I definitely think it does have an impact on all the cases that are happening, because some of these cases, if we had pre-clearance, if we had Section 5, if we had, more coverage for Section 203 that talks about language equity and access, we wouldn't have these cases needed to be going to court at this point. But because all those things were gutted, we have to bring those cases so we can get some of that empowerment and some of those rights back for our communities.
That's insane. Like, just to make sure I understand. So Shelby v. Holder, like there are states that are historically known for upholding voter suppression tactics. And instead of having to be held accountable for that, they no longer have to, as well as the record keeping that they were required to do. So that's been dismantled too. Mm-hmm. Wow.
Yeah.
And so now the onus is on voting rights organizations to do the work that the government should be doing. Section 2 being constantly under attack. I was looking at Democracy Docket, all the redistricting cases that they have, and about half of them are under Section 2, like claims. And so it's clear that it's under attack. Can we also attribute that to Shelby v. Holder, or like what can we attribute all this recurring attacks on voting rights, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, as well as just Georgia voting rights here?
I think kind of going along the lines that Anna was talking about, it's now up to private plaintiffs to enforce voting rights much more so than it has been before. And so that's part of the reason why you're seeing so many redistricting lawsuits initiated by private plaintiffs across this country, because we are having to do the work that again the DOJ used to be a check on in the past. I know this gets talked about a lot, but the dissent in Shelby County by Justice Ginsburg talked about throwing away your umbrella during a rainstorm. That was the equivalent of what the Supreme Court was doing by gutting the Voting Rights Act. It was essentially saying that because it is not the 1960s anymore, we should throw away our umbrellas because we're not getting wet by the proverbial racism rain, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that speaks to the attacks that have come in the last 10 years across the board, not just related to redistricting, but you look at, again, polling place closures, where those polling place closures are happening here in Georgia. Time and time again, we see that polling places in Black majority neighborhoods are being shut down. And no one says what's going on out loud. I hear things like, it's because this is no longer compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and so we just need to shut this precinct down. But I think the effect and the outcome is that folks who are in these communities are having are facing attacks every day when it comes to voting, and again, these things would not happen in a pre-Shelby world.
Wow, yeah. Like, how many polling places would you say have closed down, like, since?
I don't have the exact number, but I know that there have been studies done and the numbers in the hundreds territory since 2013.
Versus before, it was probably nowhere near that.
Versus before, you had that oversight
Yeah.
component that that ensured that counties couldn't do an end run and shut down polling places.
And then after Shelby v. Holder was decided upon in Georgia, our then Secretary of State, who is now our current sitting governor, issued to our county elections office that a way that they can save some of their budgets was to consolidate or close down precincts because they didn't have enough staff and they didn't have enough supplies to run and administer those elections. So that was definitely a tactic that was used here to gut precincts.
And then they pass more voter suppression laws that add to the budget required to also run the election. So it's
Right.
self-fulfilling. So the argument that I've heard or seen that they do try to make on why certain decisions aren't discriminatory is the intent versus the effect. How are y'all weighing that in this case, and how do you plan to prove that, the intent?
So I can speak for our case. We're pursuing it, our litigation under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So we are trying to show that the effect of the maps is that the power of Black voters is being weakened. So we actually don't have to prove intent under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. We're just pursuing an effects-related claim that if you look at the effect of these maps, what they are doing is they are diluting the power of Black voters. Now, in order to show that, we have to go through a lot of different factors, showing that, for example, there are Black populations in the state that are compact enough that could be drawn into a district that allows Black voters to elect candidates of their choice. We have to show that there's racially polarized voting. In other words, that Black voters are voting differently than a majority of white voters, and the candidates of choice for Black voters are being defeated at the polls. So there are a lot of factors that we have to go through and show the court, but we do not have to show that there was someone in the legislature who said that they intend to discriminate against Black voters or anything of the like.
Okay. Got it. So how should maps be drawn? Like, if y'all could, write your own law or close your eyes and make a wish and we could draw maps the right way, what would it be?
If I could make a wish on map drawing, I would make it reflect more of the community and the people. I firmly believe in independent redistricting commissions, advisory boards, councils, whatever you want to call it. I believe in everyday people having a seat at a table, not having to bring a chair to the table or knock the table over or recreate the table. No, having an actual seat at the decision-making table. So I do definitely believe that we need something in Georgia like an independent redistricting commission, because we have this historic impact and this track record of just doing it wrong, and actually our legislature being okay with doing it wrong, no matter what side of the spectrum or partisanship that's happening. We keep doing it wrong, and because we keep doing it wrong, we keep failing the people of Georgia. We keep failing Georgians, and we're not being reflective of democracy, and we're not being responsive to democracy. So we're not being responsive to the issues that we need to resolve here. So I definitely think independent redistricting commissions that comprises of individuals from communities, lawmakers, legal community, advocates, organizations, let's all come together and let's re-envision what mapping and moving of population, resources, and power, what it looks like, so we can be people power, not just power when I'm upset because my party has not won, or power of when I'm upset that certain economic development is not coming to my area. So let's be people centered, not self centered.
And
How? Sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was just about to say, I can tell you exactly how I wouldn't do it, which is the way Georgia did it in 2021. Georgia called a special session, which they're required to do when they draw redistricting maps. And the way that session unfolded, I think, left a lot to be desired, to put it politely. The the session started the day after the
Election.
Braves won the World Series, and the night that the Braves won, so the night before the session was convening, was when proposed maps were dropped. These hearings that happened, they were so quick that if you blinked, you might have missed them. And then the public comment that was allowed was very, very limited. And it was clear that it wasn't actually being listened to. And so what we saw were maps that purportedly allowed for public comment, but didn't really take that feedback into account. And I think that just goes to show, when you ignore people power, you have maps that don't reflect the facts on the ground.
Yeah, I remember that time, and it doesn't feel nice to just feel like you're speaking into a void, which it definitely did seem like hearing, yeah, those committees. So with redistricting commissions in the proper way, in the ideal way that we would actually draw maps in the future, like what has to happen for that to be a thing here in Georgia?
I think that here in Georgia, we need every type of advocacy channel we can use. So that means that we still need to keep continuing to build within our communities to empower the knowledge of what is map making and how that touches our kitchen table issues. We need to continue to uplift organizations who are taking maps to court, because here in Georgia, it just seems that that's the way that we get solves with maps, is that we have to do two channels of the pushing on the outside to have meaningful input, meaningful comment, and more education to root ourselves in redistricting. And we have to take it to court here. And I think that because of just how Georgia has been set up with our constitution and how laws are enacted, that's just the way that things kind of are, but that doesn't mean it has to be the way it has to continue to be.
What are some organizations folks can look into? What are things they can do? People like where should people go if they're interested in this and want to get involved?
Yeah, I would say, like, if you want to get into the weeds, there are, many organizations like ACLU Georgia, Common Cause Georgia, Fair Districts Georgia, League of Women Voters Georgia, that are looking for folks to observe and court watch a trial, because this trial will not be streamed. So if you're not there in the room, you're going to miss all the sauciness that's going to happen. And I think there's going to be a lot of tea and a lot of hot sauce going to happen in that room. So I'm excited to see what's going to happen. I think that if you want to just learn more holistically about how redistricting impacts around the country, please look into like the Charge Hub, because it's a collective of organizations, civil rights organizations, grassroots organizations, who are creating resource banks to learn more about redistricting and how it impacts just your community, not just Georgia, and how it impacts from Congress all the way down to like local city council charter, judicial circuits. So I think there's a lot of resources out there, but we have to, lean in and find it. And then we have to like push back on our legislators. Like if your electeds aren't talking about redistricting, sometimes they don't know. So you could be their educator. So I always tell people like you go and you ask them questions, and if they don't have a meaningful answer and if they can't answer you anything, you tell them about what you know about it, and have them sit down and you have those meetings with them because people care about constituents.
Yeah, and that just reminds me of the legislator angle and the fact that we are having legislators lose their seat due to redistricting. Are there any specific legislators that like stick out in your mind to, yeah, who lost their opportunity to represent because of gerrymandering and the likes?
I think that, so I'm going to just date myself in age. So I'll take it back to 2010. We had in the Atlanta metro area and then like our southwest rural area, our black belt, we had legislators that were packed into districts. So I was just like this bubbly, like, I'm not going to say how old I was, but I was just really bubbly, like, what's going on? They're not going to be running again. And then it's to find out it's because they've been packed into a district, and then like they're packed against like an incumbent that's been there maybe for 10 years. Maybe wasn't doing anything great, but because they're an incumbent, usually incumbents, they kind of win on the ballot. So we have that history of doing that here, which is definitely problematic because we don't have as many competitive districts and seats here in Georgia. So we had that happen. I think that we had one surprise for the 2022. I have a little chuckle in my voice because I just find it funny how that happened. Bonnie Rich, she lost her seat and she was the chair. Yeah. And, they drew her out of her own district and made her compete against someone who was more, how do I put it, more of a fanatic of other sides that I may not agree with. So that was an interesting one. And I think that in that district, they actually got someone who was worse than her or more problematic than her.
Yeah, let's just say that. Yeah, she was the chair of the redistricting committee, right? Yeah,
Mm-hmm,
and she
yeah.
got redistricted out of her own, yeah, the irony, the sweet, sweet irony.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Can you speak to how it affects communities and districts when they have their legislator or commissioner or whoever just displaced essentially?
I was just at a community like meeting in Cobb County, and I was talking to an individual, and they were saying that because of where they live, all of their seats have been redistricted. So the folks who represented them 3 or 4 years ago, from school board, county commission, state legislature, none of those folks represent them. And they had no clue that was going to be the case until they went to go vote. So happily, they voted during early voting, and they were able to quickly go educate themselves on who are these other candidates, but they had no idea that they had been redistricted out of all of their seats that really matters to the core of what's happening at their kitchen table.
And so there's no real voter education going on either when folks are redistricted and someone else is representing them that they have no idea who it is.
I wouldn't say there isn't any real voter education. I think that it becomes a lag in how can you hold this person accountable when you have no idea their platform, their issues, how they're going to be responsive and reflective of what's happening to your community.
Right. No, I mean it's all extremely important but it can be very easily confusing and get conflated, and so understandably not a lot of people understand like the gravity of it all, but that's why I'm glad to have y'all here talking with it so folks understand. But let's say everything goes well and it's October and y'all, well, honestly, I don't know about the timeline of how decisions come through, but let's just say y'all won, right? Y'all got your way. And it's now 2024. How do you guys see things going? Do you think it'll affect the presidential election? Like, what do you think? is going to happen.
Yeah, well, I won't speculate as to the outcome of the presidential election one way or another, but I think if we succeed in court and we get new maps in place, I mean, I think that Georgia voters can feel better knowing that the maps that are in place, these bones of our democracy that we keep talking about, that they actually reflect Georgia's population better and in a way that's fairer than they did before. And I think that's something that's really, really important. It's something that affects everything, like we've been talking about this whole time. And it ensures that, you know, we're litigating on the state legislative map, so state house, state senate. So again, going back to, you know, the way that the decisions of the Georgia General Assembly affect people in their day-to-day lives, I think it will have an impact on how people's lives change and how future legislative sessions go. Right now, you go to a legislative session that happens at the beginning of every year. It's just a constant stream of attacks on voting rights, on reproductive freedom, you know, every sort of civil rights issue. So, you know, if these maps become fairer and more reflective of Georgia as a whole, I'm hopeful that our policies will also reflect that as well.
So if y'all win these cases, I'm just like thinking about the timeline. Like, we have legislative session, regular session 2024. Then there will be a special session, or will the new map drawing be in that same session, January through?
It depends a little bit on the timing of a decision. You know, if we're successful in the litigation in September, or there's another trial that's scheduled on redistricting later on in the fall as well, and if an order comes through, the legislature will have the first crack at redrawing the maps. So at that point, the governor, who's in charge of calling a special session, will have to decide when that will be. If it's really close to the regular legislative session in January, maybe that gets lumped in. If it happens earlier, maybe that legislative session happens a couple months before that. But no matter what, there will be a clock on the legislature to be able to have the first crack at fixing the issues if the judge finds that the maps violate the Voting Rights Act. And then once the legislature has a first crack, the map will go back to the court to be approved, whether or not those violations have actually been fixed in the map. And so there'll be an opportunity for objections to be made to the maps, and then after that process happens, is when we will hopefully have a new map.
Okay, so that's kind of nice to hear that it still has to be court approved. So it pretty much, if you win these cases, we are guaranteed to have a VRA approved maps in Georgia in time for 2024 election.
Hopefully, yes.
Yeah, I'm like, hopefully.
Yeah, I need to knock on some wood at this point.
Look, I got good vibes. I have good energy about this all. I believe in y'all. I believe in you, Rahul. Like, y'all are gonna do great. So I'm excited to hear what comes from this. I hope this was very informative. If you didn't know about everything redistricting, now you know, especially what's happening in our home state of Georgia. So thank you guys so much for taking the time out today to talk with me and just explain this all and get into the weeds of things.
Thank you so much for having us. Yeah,
absolutely. So thank you all so much for tuning into another episode of Georgia Smothered and Covered. Please check all the links and things we have below for ways you can get involved and learn more. And tune in to us next time. Bye.